I'm Cindy Kelly, Atomic Heritage Foundation, and it is December 7th, 2017 in Las Cruces, New Mexico. And I'm with Jim Eckles, and I'd like to start by asking him to say his full name and spelling it.
Jim Eckles, E-C-K-L-E-S.
Terrific. Now, Jim, why don't you just tell us a little bit about your background and how you became so familiar with the Trinity Site?
I came to Las Cruces to work at White Sands Missile Range back in 1977. And the missile range is where Trinity Site is located. And I'd only been in the public affairs office for a couple of weeks when we had the open house, which was always the first Saturday in October, at the Trinity Site. So I went along with the rest of the office and experienced it. It was a hot day, close to 100 degrees, and we probably had 700 or 800 visitors at the site. It was a very formal kind of ceremony and whatnot. And so it was interesting. And then I worked in public affairs for the next 30 years. And as the owners of Trinity Site, so to speak, I got interested in the history. I wanted to know more about it because people, whenever you do an open house or you had people that you would take on a tour, they'd ask you questions about Trinity. Where is it? What's it about? Where people were? Those kinds of things. And so you had to gather this information to be able to answer those questions. And so it was just a long process of learning about the site, as well as other things at the missile range, like wildlife and treasure, and UFOs and aliens and things like that. Those kinds of questions come up at White Sands. But I focused on Trinity Site, and I ended up doing a lot of the open houses, organizing them, and conducting a lot of the tours in between. People that had enough clout or people that had a legitimate interest. News media, they were often allowed to go to Trinity Site between the open houses, and we would escort them in and show them around. So I did that for 30 years, and I ended up at the end of that period writing the little brochure for the missile range about Trinity Site. The archaeologist who got money from the Department of Army asked me to create the signs, the metal signs that are out there permanently on display. I did stuff on the website. I retired 10 years ago from White Sands, but I continue in association with the White Sands Missile Range and Trinity Site. I'm a volunteer for the open houses. I sit at ground zero and answer questions. I have a sign that says free answers behind me on the fence. And so I also, when I retired, wrote a book about White Sands Missile Range called Pocket Full of Rockets. And it's kind of the stories and history behind the missile range. It's not an academic history, it's more of a social history. And there's a large chapter in there on Trinity Site. And after that was published, one of the people at White Sands that I worked with suggested that I take that chapter out and turn it into a smaller book, because more people are interested in Trinity Site as a rule than they are at White Sands Missile Range. And so I did that a couple of years later and released that. And so it's Trinity Site, the history and stories of National Atomic, no, I don't remember what the title is. You guys can look it up. Anyway, so I wrote that book, and that's now available. And it's pretty much a history of Trinity Site. I tried to focus on that. There are so many books, so many shows about the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos that there's no way I was going to be able to wade into that pool. I just focused on Trinity Site because it's what I know. And I got to meet in that 30 years a number of the scientists, a lot of the support people, the soldiers who lived and worked out there, and got to talk to them about what it was like. And so I have a little bit of knowledge that's probably different than the big books that you see.
Terrific. Well, that's exactly what we want you to share with us.
Okay.
This is great. Why don't we start? If you can give us a little run up to the Trinity Site. I mean, why were they testing the bomb in July of 1945?
Okay. that's kind of a long story. I'll try to keep it as short as possible. But because it's a backstory, and I started in my book with pretty much James Chadwick, the English scientist, 1932, discovering the neutron. Because up until the 1930s, which isn't that long ago, we really didn't know much about the structure of matter, the subatomic particles and charges and stuff. So Chadwick comes up with the neutron. We knew about protons and electrons and how an atom was formed. And the scientists, when they saw that there was a neutron, they thought, well, that's interesting because it won't be repelled by the negative charges of the electrons, and it won't be repelled by the positive charges of the protons in the nucleus. In other words, a proton or a neutron could penetrate an atom and actually collide with the nucleus. And boy, what would happen if it was going fast enough? And what happens, of course, eventually is it's like a bowling ball going down an alley. When it hits those pins, stuff flies. And that's what a neutron does when it strikes a nucleus. The bonding forces are split apart, energy is released, radiation comes flying out, particles come flying out, and it multiplies. Now, that was theorized, and of course they had to prove that it was possible. So Enrique Fermi in Italy first does it. He first splits an atom in his laboratory, but he doesn't know it. He doesn't realize it. It's up to the Germans a few years later to actually realize that they've split an atom, and they do it in the laboratory, and they come up with a simpler atom, barium, in the laboratory, and they're the ones that coined the word fission that we use now, which means splitting an atom. So this progresses, and people start theorizing, well, what happens if you could get a chain reaction going? You split an atom, and it sends out enough neutrons out of that splitting to split other atoms, and that cascades to more and more atoms. And what if that all happens very quickly? Would you have an explosion? Or if you did it very slowly, could you have a nuclear reactor produce continuous heat or energy? And so people started to look at that and run experiments in the lab to see if that was possible. And in that process, Leo Szilard, one of the immigrants, the scientists who fled Europe, along with Edward Teller and a lot of these other Jewish scientists, fled Hitler, came to the United States and realized that, boy, you might be able to build a bomb with producing a chain reaction in a fissionable material like uranium. And so they decided they needed to warn the United States because the United States wasn't paying much attention to it. So Szilard proposed a letter to President Roosevelt. And he knew that the U.S. government wasn't going to pay any attention to him, so he got Albert Einstein to sign it. Einstein being the most famous scientist at the time, the 20th century, in fact. So Einstein signs the letter, and it goes to the president. And the government takes a slow, step-by-step investigation and process to see if this will actually work and stuff. And in well, let's back up a little bit. They decided to actually pursue building a bomb, and Roosevelt signed the paperwork on December 6th, 1941, the day before Pearl Harbor, which I think is pretty interesting. So they decide to do this, and it becomes an industrial complex kind of endeavor because they realized to separate the U-235 from U-238. Uranium is a naturally occurring element in the crust of the Earth. It's about as common as, in fact, it's more common, I think, than tin and silver and some of the other elements. There's a lot of it out there, but at the time we didn't know that. Excuse me. And so it turns out that there are lots of isotopes of uranium. The most common form is U-238, and 99.2% of all the uranium out there is that form. It doesn't fission. You can't do a chain reaction with it. U-235 is a little more unstable, and it will fission. but it only accounts for less than 1% of the uranium out there. And so the scientists working for the government realized, well, we got to separate the U-235 from the 238. And so they built Oak Ridge. Oak Ridge, at the beginning of World War II, was nothing. It was farmland, basically. At the end of the war, it was the third largest community in Tennessee. I mean, it was a huge complex, an industrial complex, and it was built to separate 235 from 238. Used a couple of different methods. One was a filtering process. You'd gasify the uranium, run it through these filters. The bigger atoms, the 238, would get held up in the filters. The 235 would go through, and you'd scrape off the 238. And you're basically getting 235 an atom at a time. Very slow and arduous process. Another process was to gasify it and run the gas around an electromagnetic field in a curve, and the bigger atoms, the 238s, would go to the outside. The 235, being a little smaller and lighter, would stay to the inside of that curvature. They'd filter off the 238s and collect the 235s. Again, an atom at a time, basically, a very slow process. So when Los Alamos was established, with Oppenheimer as its head, as the laboratory to design and actually build a bomb based on uranium-235, they came up with a very simple design. And to make this work, you've got to get a critical mass of uranium-235. You've got to get the atoms close enough together that when you start splitting them, that atom breaks apart and 2 neutrons come out of each one, and it splits 2 atoms then, and that splits 4, and so on. It cascades, that you get the atoms close enough together that there's an atom right next door that can hit, and to get that chain reaction going. So the idea for the uranium bomb was to simply shoot one lump of uranium into another lump at high speed using explosives to accelerate it down a gun tube, get the critical mass, and boom. And of course, this cascading of atoms splitting happens in just a few millionths of a second, and you got an explosion. And so they were getting plutonium from Hanford, and they realized that in looking at the laboratory results that you can't send one lump of plutonium into another lump in the design, the bomb, the gun design. It won't work. The 2 pieces, as they get close together, will start to fission before they get together as a tight critical mass. And you'll blow apart, and you'll get kind of a dirty, low-yield explosion. Not what you're looking for if you're in the military. And so the people at Los Alamos came up with a different design, a design called implosion, where they'd take a ball of plutonium, and it's about the size of a softball, a youth-size softball, surround it with 5,000 pounds of high explosives, divided into 32 individual lenses or chunks of high explosives, and compress that ball down to the size of a golf ball or so, and get that critical mass and get an explosion. And that's why there's Trinity Site. They didn't know if that was going to work. The trick, and this was an engineering timing effort, not much science once you've got past that point, was to get those 32 lenses of plutonium or high explosives to all go off at the same exact instant, so you're compressing that ball from all angles. If you've got one that goes too early or some that go too late, the ball gets warped and out of shape, and you get a low-yield explosion, not much bang, just a dirty explosion, more radiation probably than you do explosion. So that was the trick, and they decided that they needed to test it since they were so unsure of it. In fact, before Trinity Site, they were testing implosion designs on pipes and stuff at Los Alamos just the week before they did the test, to make sure that this thing was going to work as designed.
Oh, that's great. Now, tell us about the pressures on the scientists to conduct this test by July 16th. Why was it important to meet that deadline as opposed to the week after that they really thought they needed more time.
Well, I think there was pressure at the very beginning. I mean, there's a lot of people that talk about the Potsdam conference that Truman wanted to know before meeting with Stalin what we had and whether it was going to work or not, et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, the bomb was initially scheduled for July 4th. They wanted to make it the ultimate firecracker, the 4th of July firecracker. And then uncertainties and weather issues started interfering with that schedule and pushing it to the right further and further. So the 16th was a day that the weather guys said looks like a good day based on the typical summer thunderstorms rolling through at that time of year. And of course it matched up with the Potsdam conference and stuff. So there must have been some pressure to get it done, get word to Truman that this thing actually worked. Now, of course, that's not taking into consideration that we already had the bomb design, which is the one used at Hiroshima, and we weren't going to test it, and we were pretty sure it was going to work. So Truman could have said the same thing to Stalin without the test, because we had the gun design in the bag, ready to go.
That's very interesting, because you just demythified a myth.
Well, I think there are a lot of myths associated with this stuff. Things get, and we'll talk about some of that, like Trinity Site and the glass that was formed. What I learned when I first got there, it's not true. Not true at all.
Wow. Talk about how they chose the site and the name of the desert there.
Okay. The Los Alamos people wanted a place that was isolated. They had a whole series of criteria. They wanted land that already belonged to the government. They wanted very low population densities, close to Los Alamos, close to roads and highways, highways and railroads, that kind of thing. And so they looked at a lot of different places that just came up on the radar, like the sand dunes in southern Colorado, an island off the west coast of California, the sand dunes off the coast of Texas, the lava fields up by Grants. Most of these places had problems, population or land ownership issues and stuff. They also looked at two places in the Alamogordo bombing range. The Alamogordo bombing range was created back in 1942 and it was a typical southwestern training range. This was for bombing crews for B-24s and B-17s, eventually B-29s. They flew out of what's now Holloman Air Force Base, just west of Alamogordo. And so that land was taken from ranchers, or leased from ranchers, starting in 1942, and it ran up the Tularosa Basin from Highway 70 up through Mockingbird Gap and the Oscura Mountains to almost Highway 380, and set aside as a bombing range. So Los Alamos went down and looked at those places in 1944. Bainbridge, the test director, was in charge of finding a site. And they looked in the middle of the bombing range, down in the Tularosa Basin. But there are a number of problems there, mainly that Alamogordo and Tularosa are just directly east of the middle of the bombing range. Also, if they'd put it there, they would have put the bombing range completely out of business. There would have been no way to run a bombing range with Trinity Site in the middle of it. So another site they looked at up to the north out of the Tularosa Basin, just to the west of the Oscura Mountains, was at the very north end of the bombing range, and they could take that and not kill the bombing range. And it was wide open country, very few communities, especially downwind from there, no large ones anyway. And so in 1944, the middle of 44, they decided to go there. And the area just to the west of that is called the Jornada del Muerto. The Spanish, this was all part of the Spanish Empire for centuries. People don't realize that the Spaniards were here longer than the United States has been a country. Anyway, they came out of Mexico and came up the Rio Grande at El Paso and established a capital at Santa Fe. And the road they built along the Rio Grande was called the Camino Royale. And north of what's now Las Cruces, the river takes a lot of bends. There's some canyons in it and stuff. It makes it hard going if you're trying to pull carts and stuff to Santa Fe. But if you went out to the east, between the San Andres Mountains and the river, it's just kind of flat plains, and the going is pretty quick. The only problem with that is there's no water there, or very little. Plus, the Apache hang out in the mountains around there. And so the Spaniards built their road on those plains, and they got attacked a lot. A lot of them died of thirst or starvation. So there are a lot of deaths on the road, and they nicknamed the road the Journey or Road of Death from Las Cruces basically up to about Socorro, which would be directly west of Trinity Site. So the Jornada del Muerto is actually an area, a road area, from Las Cruces to Socorro. But journalists and authors for decades couldn't help making that symbolic jump from Trinity Site, where the atomic bomb was born, to the Journey of Death or Road of Death to the west. They wanted to smash those two things together and make some kind of symbolism. We made fun of it in my office for a long time, and I don't see it very much anymore. But it is a desert that mostly creosote and mesquite bushes. And so Manhattan Project had an 18 by 24 mile rectangle of property at the north end of the bombing range to use. One of the most common questions at Trinity Site now, why this spot for ground zero? And you know, there's nothing that I found in the records, but we have theorized that it's because of the nature of the bomb. So you have a chunk of land that you're restricted to. You know where the wind's going to be blowing basically year-round, and you know that you don't want to be downwind from an atomic bomb explosion because of fallout. So you think about that and you realize that you want your ground zero then, since the winds are out of the west and southwest, you want your ground zero to be on the east side of your rectangle, and then you want to put all your bunkers, your instrumentation, all your personnel in a semicircle upwind to the west and southwest and the north a little bit. So that, using that kind of logic, that dictates where you put ground zero and then where you put all the instrumentation in your rectangle. And it works. And so we've got, you set up ground zero, that's the most important point, and then everything is built off of that. You go and you establish your bunkers and your base camp, your control bunker and all those things. And so that started in 1944, in December of 1944. The military police were the first military personnel on site, and they were from Los Alamos. And Marvin Davis, one of the MPs I got to know fairly well, talked about going down there. And he talks about going to Los Alamos at first. They were a mounted unit. They rode patrol around Los Alamos on horseback. He said they didn't even have weapons at first. They used flashlights and billy clubs as weapons. A lot of those guys then moved to Trinity Site at base camp and brought their horses with them. Horses were quickly abandoned because the distances were much too great to ride horses. Plus, you can see for miles. It's easy to see 10 miles across the Jornada del Muerto from an elevated spot. You didn't need to go ride boundary. You could just sit in a high point and watch. So they got there in 44, December, and according to Marvin, the buildings, a lot of the buildings were already there because Bainbridge and his guys had hired a contract to assemble old CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps buildings that they took from other places in the state and erected down at base camp, which is 10 miles from ground zero, so that these guys, these scientists, these soldier technicians, support people could live while they worked on developing the site. So they had a mess hall and barracks and a PX and laboratory space for some of the scientists. A small cluster, a small little city of buildings, so to speak.
How many people ended up living there and for how long?
That's hard to put an exact number on it because it was constantly in flux. You know, there was permanent party, military police, cooks, engineers, folks like that. There were military personnel. And from the photos, it looks like there were, 50, 60 of those guys. But then there were scientists and other folks always coming and going, people that were interested in setting up instrumentation at the site, building structures at the site that they were going to be using during the test. They would come maybe for a week, go back to Los Alamos, come back later. So that number was always fluctuating. At its peak times, they talk about the mess hall producing hundreds of meals a day. So at the site, you get ground zero, and the scientists made the decision that nobody was going to be closer than 10 miles outside of a bunker. So they built bunkers at 10,000 yards, which is a little over 5 miles, on the south, west, and north basic compass points. And people were in those bunkers for the test. And the north and west bunkers were basically camera bunkers. The north one being the prime one for the photos that we see. The motion picture footage and all those still images of the very early stages of the explosion and stuff were taken from the north 10,000 yard bunker. The south 10,000 yard bunker was the control bunker. Everything fed out of there. When you see pictures of that, you'll see commo lines coming out of the back side of it. There's an adjoining bunker for power, to power everything that was inside the control bunker. Because everything was set to go off of this timer, the sequence that they had, so that they wanted to make sure that cameras, seismographs, and all the other instrumentation all turned on at the right time. Again, we've got cameras out there that were running 1,000 frames a second. Now, it doesn't take very long for a camera running that speed to run out of film. It's shooting through there. And if you turn on that camera a couple of seconds too early, the film's gone by the time the explosion occurs. And if you turn it on a little late, well, you're just too late. So they had to get all of that exact. And so in South 10,000, there was a master switch that fed everything to turn everything on around the site, set off the flares and all that as well. Brixner, Berlin Brixner, was one of the photographers. He was the one at North 10,000 that's credited for getting most of those photos of the explosion. He said that, now the test was supposed to be going at 4 a.m., but got delayed until 5:30 because of storm clouds. Brixner said that he knew there was a delay, but he couldn't hear the loudspeaker. He was so far away. He had no idea when the test was set to go. And so he's just sitting around twiddling his thumbs, waiting for something to happen, and his camera turned on. And he knew at that point that the test was going to come up in a few seconds, and it was time to go to work. So South 10,000 was very important for that reason. That triggered everything that took place out on the site. Then, so those are manned bunkers. There were also unmanned bunkers closer to ground zero that were constructed. Some of those are just 800 yards out. For instance, there's one that people drive by on their way into Trinity Site. It's right on the right side of the road, the south side of the road. And it's 800 yards from ground zero. It was initially intended to be a photo bunker. So, and you can look, if you go into it, you can look out the tubes on the east end of the bunker, and they look right at where the tower was standing. However, they found that that close in, the camera, since it's looking straight out at the tower, radiation, gamma radiation, would have come flying through there and right into the camera and spoiled the film. And so they had to come up with a different plan. And Brixner talks about taking cameras and putting them in lead boxes and pointing them straight up in the air. And then above the box, and they put leaded glass in the top of each box, and put a mirror there, angled at 45 degrees or so the camera is looking off the mirror at the tower. And so the straight line of sight radiation wouldn't affect the film. And so those boxes were set on a sled right beside this 800-yard bunker. It had a 1,000-foot cable on it, and so the guys could pull it back right after the test. and not having to go up and try to retrieve the cameras that close to ground zero. It would have been unsafe. So there's another couple of bunkers, unmanned bunkers on the north side that are still standing. Those are kind of the only relics left from the explosion or the test at Trinity Site. And then, of course, base camp being 10 miles away, upwind, was the old Dave McDonald Ranch House, ranch area, and that's where the cluster of buildings was constructed.
So in your book you explain the difference between the different ranch houses. So was this George McDonald Ranch House among the cluster? And
all right.
Tell us about this.
There's often confusion about the McDonald Ranch House at Trinity Site and the National Historic Landmark. There are actually two McDonald Ranch houses, and that's the confusion. They were brothers. The one close to ground zero, about 2 miles from ground zero, belonged to George. And it was actually built in 1913 by the Schmidt family. They came up, Franz Schmidt was a German immigrant, married a gal from Texas. They came into the area below the Oscura Mountains and homesteaded there, and had a ranch where they raised cows and sheep. It was quite a big operation, and their house burned down in 1912. So they lived in the barn and had this new house built in 1913. And it's 4 rooms, it's adobe, and it's a very nice structure with oak floors and all that. And the Schmidt family, though, left in 1920, and we think the McDonalds bought it then. And George McDonald was living there then when the Alamogordo bombing range was formed in 1942, forcing them out. And so that house was a convenient location to make the clean room for the assembly of the plutonium core for the test. The other McDonald house belonged to Dave. Well, it's actually a partnership. Dave and Ross, I think, his brother, had a ranch to the west, to the southwest, and that ended up belonging or being the setup for base camp. There was a third McDonald ranch in the area, but nobody knows about it. It doesn't confuse anybody. It was Tom McDonald, and just to the south of George's place, over Mockingbird Gap, in a little canyon where there's good water, is Tom. He was the father, George and Dave and Ross. And in fact, when he was forced to leave, he met the Army with a gun in hand. He wasn't going to leave. Family members were able to convince him to give up the gun and then leave. So those are the ranches that were used, and the George McDonald Ranch House was convenient because it was the nicest permanent structure close to ground zero, and they took the master bedroom and turned it into a clean room. They put plastic over the windows, they taped up all the cracks and stuff. There's a sign they chalked on the door about cleaning your feet before entering the room, trying to seal it up to keep dust out of it for this assembly of the plutonium core. And most people, and as part of the open house now, you can go see it, this house. It's been restored. Most people think, well, why wasn't it blown apart, being 2 miles from ground zero? Because we've all seen that footage from Nevada where houses are blown apart in nuclear explosions. And shock waves do funny things. You know, from the ranch house, you cannot see ground zero. There's a little bit of a ridge, and the shock wave may have just kind of bounced over the ranch house. It did knock out the windows to the house and the doors, but the house was pretty much undamaged structurally by the explosion.
What about the base camp? Is that undamaged as well?
Right. Base camp being 10 miles away, the witnesses were told to lay on the ground. There's a dirt berm there, were used for catching water for the livestock. And they were told to lay along that, facing away. And of course, everybody had welder's glass, either goggles or a piece of glass mounted in a piece of cardboard. And they were told after the first few seconds that they could turn and look at the explosion through their welder's glass. Some just looked at it straight away, wanted to see that bright flash of light and stuff at the very beginning of the explosion. Others followed orders. Some didn't follow orders about being in the bunkers at at South 10,000. For instance, Lieutenant Bush, who was camp commander and head of security, decided he was not going to sit in the bunker at South 10,000. He went outside, and he kind of was in a hunch on his haunches, looking away with his head down. And he said in his account that the light was so bright that it was filtering through his eyelids, and he touched his eyelids to make sure that his eyes were closed. It was that bright. Then he stood up, and the shockwave blew him over. Didn't hurt him or anything, but it did knock him down. And I think there was another person there, same thing, but I don't know who it was. So damage, of course, varies by where you are. Some damage was reported over 100 miles away, windows broken, for instance.
How about, you mentioned the clean room, and I know you have a story of Herb Blair, who took the plutonium down there. And why don't you talk about that there's a photo of him.
Okay, coming in.
Yeah.
You know, the plutonium core, as I said earlier, was about the size of a softball. And I use a softball now as a visual aid at Trinity Site, Ground Zero. And people are amazed that something that small could produce an atomic bomb explosion equal to 20,000 tons of TNT. But so it was two hemispheres, though, when he brought it down, because they were going to insert another little sphere inside the plutonium core. And that was a neutron initiator. It was a ball made of polonium and beryllium. And when those are squeezed together, they naturally produce neutrons, which it was felt could kickstart the chain reaction in the plutonium, which is being squashed all around it. At the clean room, they're going to assemble the core. And you've got two pieces of plutonium. Herb Blair is carrying those in a special padded box. And there's a famous picture of him coming through the door to the bedroom of the McDonald Ranch house. And on that door, in the photo, you can see some of the words, wipe your feet before entering, etc. And so he's got this box. Now, the little urchin, they called it, the little initiator with the polonium and the beryllium, came down, and I'm trying to remember who had that in his. He carried it in his pocket. And there were two of them. There was an active one, and then there was a dummy one. And the story was that he would go up to a guy and move him around in his hand and say, which one's the real one? And they were aghast, because they're going to go, well, what if you put the dummy one in the bomb? I mean, it's not going to work. And he reassured them that the real one produced its own heat. It was warm to the touch. And the dummy one, of course, was cold ambient temperature. So it was easy to tell them apart. So anyway, they get to, Blair brings that into the clean room at the McDonald. I always call it the Schmidt McDonald Ranch House, because the Schmidts should get credit. They built the house and established the ranch and everything. Anyway, he brings it in there, and then they proceed to put those pieces together. There's a step in there that most people never talk about, and it explains one of the pictures. Blair's bringing this box in, carrying it in one hand, because it only weighs 13 to 14 pounds. It's very light. I mean, not for a ball of metal that size, it's fairly dense and heavy, but it's nothing that you can't carry in one hand. And so in the photo where they're loading the core into the sedan to take to Ground Zero, two guys are carrying the core in a box on a litter. And you're going, what's that about if it only weighs 14 pounds? I mean, that's crazy. And that's because in there, once they get the core together, they insert that into a uranium plug. And this plug is a column of uranium, and it's got a point in it so you can insert this ball. And so you've got one cylinder then that's going to slide into the center of the bomb mechanism down at Ground Zero. This uranium plug adds a lot of metal to this equation. And in fact, it turns out that the plug then, the total plug package, is probably about 120 pounds. And so that's why there are two guys carrying it between them on a litter to put it in the back seat of the sedan. So the house is part of the National Historic Landmark because it's a pretty important part of the process there. And there are other stories associated with it. One of the stories is that they had jeeps outside or vehicles outside with the engines running just in case they had to get away quickly. I think that's probably a baloney story because the scientists realized that if something went wrong in there, they were dead anyway. There wouldn't have been time to get in the car, to run out of the room and get in the car. They would have received such a massive dose of radiation, they wouldn't have made it. So I think that's probably not true. There are other stories too, like raising the bomb to the top of the tower that when I first heard it was that the guys were piling mattresses under it. And you could see that in the footage. They're putting these big bundles of mattresses from base camp underneath the bomb as they raise it up, because it's going up very slowly. And the story I heard was they didn't want it to explode if they dropped it. Well, Bainbridge, I found some document where he said, no, they didn't worry about it exploding. They didn't want to break it if they dropped it. Whole different story. So anyway, that's what happened to the ranch house. And again, it's part of the National Historic Landmark. And it's important because of the work done there for the Manhattan Project, but it's also a really cool old ranch house that dates back to the pre-statehood time, or right at statehood for New Mexico. It was a tough life.
Maybe this is a good time to talk about the land. If they were ranchers, how much land do you need to sustain a head of cattle?
Right. The southern part of New Mexico is ranch land out there. It's desert ranch land. And so it's not very good ranch land. I mean, you'll get into arguments and it's a kind of a sensitive issue. But the amount of land needed to raise a nice herd of cows so that you can make a living and make a profit off of it gets to be kind of large. The Bureau of Land Management, for instance, in this area, southern part of the state, leases land to ranchers so that they can graze their cattle on public property. And they go out and look at that land to see what the carrying capacity is, how many cows per square mile that land can support, how much water is there and how much grass is there. And so here in the southern part of the state, some of that carrying capacity is only 6 to 8 cows per square mile. Up around the Trinity Site area, it was 10 to 12 cows per square mile. So Dave McDonald, where base camp was located, he and his brother they only owned 1 square mile, that's 640 acres outright. That enabled them to lease from the state and federal governments land for grazing, and they leased over 20,000 acres of land. So we've got, I think it's over 30 square miles of land to support 2 families, to have a herd large enough, the several hundred cows you would need to support that family. So ranching around here is big ranches. It's not like back in the Midwest or the South or something where you can raise that many cows on, you know, a few dozen acres, especially if you've got feed for them and stuff. It's a tough existence out here.
That's very interesting. One more thing, maybe you could just mention how much rain you typically get.
Okay, rain in the southern part of the state varies a lot because of the terrain. The terrain kind of drives how rainfall is distributed. Here in Las Cruces, we probably get about 8 inches a year, and that's pretty typical for the flats. But every time you've got a mountain range, like just to the east of us, the Oregon Mountains that top out at 9,000 feet, and in the summer when that damp air comes off the coast and gets shoved up by the winds up into the upper atmosphere by the mountains, it starts to condense and form clouds right over the mountains. And those quickly build into summer thunderstorms that then move off of the mountains and drop rain, usually on the east side of those mountain ranges. So here in Las Cruces, we can be sitting here and see those clouds building there. We may not get any rain, but just 10, 15 miles to the east of us, somebody may get 2, 3, 4 inches in a big storm burst, something like that. So it varies from place to place. With the folks right on the east side of the mountain ranges getting much more than those of us on the west side. 8 inches is common here on the east side where the missile range headquarters is, more like 12, 13 inches a year. So it does vary a lot. And then the vagaries of year-to-year climate really have an effect, because when you have a ranch and you use public property, the idea is that you're getting grazing rights very cheaply, and the natural grass is what's going to feed these cows. Hopefully you've got windmills and springs to water them, so it doesn't really matter too much if it doesn't rain. But if the grass doesn't grow, if it doesn't rain, there won't be any grass growing, any new grass. And suddenly you're faced as a rancher with bringing in supplemental feed, moving your cows to another pasture somewhere else, maybe out of state, or selling your cows because they're going to die. So that figures into the equation as well. When there's a drought year and very little rain, it gets really tough for ranchers. Our rainy season, when we get this 8 inches of rain, 75–80% of it comes in July, August, first week or so of September. It's almost like clockwork. And it's based on how the high and low pressure set up and push moisture our way. And so everybody knows that. We call it the monsoon season. And so for the folks at Trinity Site, they were just there at the beginning of July. And everybody talked about in the old days of the monsoon starting on July 4th. So everybody associated with the project that was familiar with New Mexico knew that thunderstorms were going to be an issue at that time of year. And boy, they're pretty unpredictable. It really would have been tough back in those days. They didn't have the satellite imagery and all that. It would have been based on fronts pushing moisture this way or not pushing, and the timing of all that. It would have been difficult for the weather guys to predict. And then the vagaries day to day, how big those storms are going to be, how ferocious they're going to be, whether they're going to be at this spot or 20 miles up this way or this way. I mean, it's all very unpredictable. And so it would have been quite a nightmare, a lot of pressure on the weather guy for Trinity Site. And so the night before the explosion, as I said, it was scheduled for 4 a.m., but there were thunderstorms in the area during the night. And they would have been coming off the mountains to the west, San Mateo's and other ranges, the Black Range, to the west of the Rio Grande, and drifting towards Trinity Site. And what happens when those storms, depending on their size, as they drift off the mountains, they start to lose some of their punch. And the rain lets up and gets less and less as the storm. And eventually the clouds will break apart and just become clouds, and they won't have rain in them and stuff. So you'll read about the Trinity Site test, about it raining at the site. And one of the guys talks about South 10,000, that Oppenheimer and Groves, when they're talking about the delay, are dodging puddles of water in the asphalt. And it makes it sound like it rained all over the place. But I think it was more typical. I think it was very spotty and very light. Because when I've talked to guys that were at base camp, which is about 7 miles from South 10,000, they were supposed to lay in the dirt and look away from the explosion. I said, well, gee, was it muddy? Was it wet? And they'll go, no, not at all. And in fact, then I ran across an account a few years ago from a guy who wrote about his experiences for his family. It was a personal account. And he said that he'd seen a lot of this stuff about the rain and all that. And he said, I didn't get any rain. It was very spotty and very light. There was kind of a drizzle at times. So in my mind, that's pretty typical of what happens, especially that late into the night for a thunderstorm. And so the weather guy predicted they would get better weather at about 5:30, and then, so they rescheduled from 4 to 5:30.
What was the danger of such a storm or even a thunderstorm to the project's test?
Well, there are a number of things to take into consideration if you've got storms. One is wind, high winds. Thunderstorms can be calm one minute and the next minute the wind's blowing 50 miles an hour. And so if you've got a storm like that blowing during the test, you're going to have radiation fallout going God knows where, because storms have got swirling winds and stuff. So that would have been very unpredictable. Also, if you're trying to set off the test during a storm, you've got to understand this is a test, and it's not a test just to see if it works. That's a big part of it, but you also want to try to get as much information as you can to see how it works, to collect as much data as you can, to see how that implosion process is working, and how sweet it's going to be as far as the design and stuff. And to be able to collect that data, you need pretty good weather. You need those cameras to be able to see things 5.5 miles away and stuff. And you can't do that in a thunderstorm. So those are a couple of the big issues that we're driving. And of course, then there's the whole issue of lightning while the bomb's sitting on the tower, which is another reason driving the decision not to wait a day till the next morning, but to go at 5:30 instead of 4. There's some pressure to get this test done because you've got an armed bomb on top of a steel tower and lightning's flashing around. You don't want, it might set off the bomb, probably not, but it might damage the bomb. And then you're back to square one. You've got to start all over. So a lot of pressure to go ahead and get the test done at 5:30.
That's good. That's good. I mean, one of the things that the Dr. Tomic opera dramatizes is the poor weatherman's position.
Right, and there's nothing he can do.
Exactly.
It's not in his hands at all. I mean, the poor guy, all he can do is do his best job, and he probably considers himself very lucky afterwards. For the test, the decision was made to place the bomb on top of a 100-foot steel tower, not drop it. That's one of the misconceptions when people arrive at Trinity Site. You'll hear people talking, well, they dropped the bomb from a 100-foot tower here. No, it was sitting static on top of the 100-foot tower. Now, the steel tower was built to support this heavy bomb because the bomb is composed of this plutonium core, which doesn't weigh much. It's got a heavy uranium sphere around it, and then there's 5,000 pounds of explosives around that, and then a steel casing around that, a small one. So this thing's pretty hefty, and they had to raise it up and put it on top of the tower. Now, the reason they did it on top of a tower was because they wanted to maximize the shock wave, the blast effect on the ground. A bomb, if it strikes the ground and explodes, the ground and the structures immediately around it absorb so much of the energy that you don't have much damage very far out. On the other hand, if you explode that bomb, say 2,000 feet above the ground, the shock wave, of course, spreads from the bomb and spreads like a megaphone coming down in a triangle and will flatten a much larger area. And I think that the military people that are in the Pentagon and everybody else that's working on this is thinking shock wave when they start thinking exploding the bomb over Japan, doing the maximum amount of physical damage that they can do. And so the 100-foot tower gives them a scaled version of this. And another thing that's important about this is that it gives them a really good view with these cameras and other instruments miles away of the bomb as it explodes on the tower. If they'd put the bomb on the ground, it would have been hard to see it. They would have been blocked by brush and stuff and all these other things, the undulations of the ground and stuff. By putting it up there, they had a nice, unobstructed view from everywhere of the beginnings of the explosion, etc. So those are the two main reasons. A third byproduct kind of reason for that is if they had exploded the bomb on the ground, they would have made a huge crater, an absolutely gigantic crater. And that would have meant a lot of sand and dirt being engulfed or sucked into the fireball and activated and turned into fallout. So that the fallout cloud from the Trinity test would have been much, much larger if they'd exploded it on the ground. As it was fairly large, much larger than Hiroshima or Nagasaki, but they kept it to a minimum by exploding it on the tower. So the tower was there, and they ran big cables off of it because they had instruments in next to the bomb trying to measure the neutron flux at the instant of explosion. And those ran down these big coaxial cables to the north. And one of the north bunkers is where they had all the instruments to collect this data and record it. They had so much stuff in there that they had to air condition the bunker because all that tube technology made the bunker so hot that it wasn't going to work. So they had a generator there, and they ran air conditioners to air condition the instruments and stuff. So this cable came off the tower underground to the bunker about 1,000 yards to the north or so. And of course that tower was vaporized in the explosion. A lot of people come and they don't understand that. They think it was just blown to pieces. It was turned to gas. It was sublimated from a solid to a gas in a fraction of a second and joined the fireball going up. The fallout created in the explosion was all the metal in the bomb itself, the tower, and then what sand and material got sucked up into the fireball. That all became part of the fallout cloud. So the plutonium core in its plug comes from the ranch house and is taken to the tower where they've put some tenting around the base of it. And they've got the bomb mechanism there, which has come down from Los Alamos. And they take the plug, and they've got a hole in the side of the mechanism to lower the plug into it, down into the center of the bomb, in the center of the explosives. And lo and behold, when they try to do this, it doesn't work. And they've got pretty tight tolerances on everything, so it's not going. And one of the scientists realizes that it's probably a temperature differential. The plutonium core and everything is pretty warm. It does generate a little of its own heat, and the rest of the bomb mechanism has been sitting there overnight, and it's pretty cool. So they let the two rest in contact with each other for a while, and the temperatures equalize and slides home. And so they button that up, and then I think there's an idea that they did the rest of the assembly of the bomb, putting it together there at the base of the tower. But in looking at the footage of them raising the bomb on the hoist to the top, none of the wiring and stuff is there. So they must have taken the bomb to the top and set it on the wooden platform that they had up there, and then connected all the detonators, put all the wiring in to make it so it would work.
Now, the recreation of the tower at Albuquerque has a cabin up there of sorts. So can you describe?
There was a bit of a shelter on top, on a couple of sides, and it was just tin roofing that you would see on a ranch house or something like that. Just to put up on along the railings around the side, and then a roof over the top to shelter them from the sun. It was not adequate to protect from rain and wind and stuff like that, but did give them some shelter from the wind and the sun while they were doing the assembly. You've got the bomb all assembled, and it's sitting there ready to go, and you've got these nuclear materials in there, and there's radiation and whatnot, and there's concern about what happens if a chain reaction just kind of starts, because we've never gone here before. And so they had a way of putting a wire. They had a little hole in the frame of the bomb, and they could put a wire all the way down to the core. And I can't remember if it's magnesium. I don't think it's manganese. Manganese, I think it is. This wire gets, if it's in presence of neutrons, gets activated itself, and it's measurable. So every few hours they would pull the wire out, put a new one in, and go back to the lab and analyze this wire to see what the neutron flux was doing inside the bomb to make sure that it was stable. And it was fine, but somebody had to climb the tower and do that every 4 hours, I think, something like that.
Interesting. Let's see. Do you want to talk any more about the high-speed photography and how they set the cameras up?
Yeah, we probably ought to talk a little bit about that, because I can talk about the color, lack of color too. So, to take pictures of this, again, I mean, people, the scientists are aware they're going to get a bright flash of light. How bright, how much, how long, etc., all those are unknowns. And so at the west and north bunkers, there are lots of cameras that get set up. There are 35 millimeter Mitchell cameras, which were kind of state of the art at that time. Gone with the Wind was filmed with 35 millimeter Mitchell cameras. So these things at like North 10,000, where Brixner was located, there were 3 Mitchell cameras, and they all had fixed lenses on them. One basically a normal size lens that would give you what an eyeball views like, and a couple of telephoto lenses to give you a closer view of what was happening. And they were running at different speeds also. Some to give you a nice slow motion image, and some to give you a normal development of the explosion. And then there are whole arrays of 16 millimeter cameras, for instance, arranged on boards, and there are pictures of this, looking at ground zero. And at both sites, they had these arrays of cameras to take as many images and running at different speeds and stuff that they could. There was color film. You never see color images and color footage of the explosion because none of it came out. They had the film got spoiled, or they had the exposures wrong, something, and it just wasn't any good. There's only one color still image from the test, and that was taken by now I'm blocking his name. Jack Abey. And Jack was a kind of a jack of all trades, doing a bunch of things, and he was working for Segre, and who gave him a camera with a little bit of film, and at base camp told him to walk out and try to get a picture of the explosion. So Jack took a chair out there, much like I'm sitting in, and turned it around and sat his arms up on the back and had his camera, and he expected some little poof of light, and so he opened the aperture all the way. And then, of course, the sky lit up, and he realized that, oops, that wasn't going to work, and he cranked it all the way down, and he clicked off 3 images, he said. And the middle one, I think, was the one that was saved and is the color image that is used now in all the stuff. And you can tell if it's right or not. Well, there are a lot of photos that get, and you look on the internet, you'll see images, color images of tests, and they're identified as Trinity Site, and they're not, because it's broad daylight for one thing. No, it can't be broad daylight. Other things are nice, clean images. Jack's is pretty dirty. It's got stuff all over it and stuff. But also the key is there's a rooster tail, a cloud of dust and stuff that's being ejected as the explosion takes place. And in Jack's photo, it's on the left. On Brixner's photo, because he's 180 degrees opposite at North 10,000, it's on the right. So we think that what's happened on some of the pictures is that they've taken Brixner's black and white picture and put it in Photoshop and colorized it. Because you got the thing coming off here to the right, and you go, no, that can't be right. Of course, they could have taken Jack's and flip-flopped the negative. It's hard to tell anymore. But that telltale sign of the rooster tail on the right or left, depending on your point of view from where you were sitting. So those were the photos were taken. There were also people watching, and photos taken from Campanilla Hill, which is 20 miles away. It's up by Stallion Range Center. And that's where the VIPs came, Edward Teller and folks like that, that didn't have anything to do with actually running the test, were brought in by bus, and they watched. And we know there was a camera up on top of one of the hills there, but I've never seen any photos taken from there. It's a long ways away. And those guys were busting in the dark and left before it got light. And I talked to one of them, and I said, well, do you remember which hill it was? Because we're not sure. There's a whole string of hills there. He said, no, we left in the dark, so I don't know where we were exactly. He was not familiar with the place so that he could tell that. So Ernest Lawrence was there. The reporter Lawrence was there. Klaus Fuchs, our spy, Russian spy, was at Campania Hill as well, because he got to watch. John Feynman was there at Campania Hill. So there were a number of people there that got to watch the explosion.
Nobody knows, or is there a number known of how many people actually were eyewitnesses to this, let's say more or less at the site?
Yeah, it was several hundred. I can tell you that for sure. But no, you can't. I don't think you can nail it down. I bet Bainbridge couldn't even nail it down at that time. There were other people that were witnesses. I got an account from a guy who he said he was a numbers puncher at Los Alamos. He knew about the explosion, knew about the test, but he wasn't invited. He wanted to see it. So he basically found out where the site was, and he looked at topo maps, and he came down the highway down there south of San Antonio and Socorro, and he found a hill, and he climbed up on that, and he was expecting the explosion at 4 a.m., and nothing happened, because he has no idea. And he's sitting there, and he sat there, and he sat there, and he said about 5:30 he decided to leave. He got up, and he had a blanket that he was sitting on, and he folded it up and threw it over his shoulder and started down the hill back to his car, and he was looking east. And whoosh, it lit up. So he got to witness it. And there were probably others. There's a story that the guy who owned the Owl Bar and the little motel that was there in San Antonio, some of the project people, the military police, were there using those rooms. They told him to come out and watch. They didn't tell him what it was, just to watch so he could see it.
That's fine. Is that the Owl Cafe?
Yes. The Owl Bar and Cafe. Still going strong. Great chili cheeseburgers.
Indeed, indeed. Let's see.
And we didn't talk about who was at the other places. So at South 10,000, where you're going to trigger the bomb, you've got Oppenheimer, because he's the chief guy of developing and designing and building this bomb. So he's there with Bainbridge, who's the test director. Now, Groves is not there, because they had a rule that Groves and Oppenheimer couldn't be in the same place when anything dangerous was happening at the same time. For instance, they didn't ever fly together. They could ride the same train together, but they never flew together. And they weren't together there. Groves was at base camp. So let's see, also Frank Oppenheimer, Robert Oppenheimer's brother, was there. A number of other people support. Lieutenant Bush was there as the camp commander and security guy. So there was a small group of people there that were in charge of actually triggering the bomb. Most people were at base camp. That's where Groves was. And he was there with a couple of the guys from Washington, Conant and what's the other guy?
Conant.
Conant, is that how you say it? And Bush, yes. They were there at base camp. Fermi was at base camp doing his little experiment, dropping the pieces of paper, plus all those support people that were assigned to the program. And a number of other folks. And a lot of these people ended up writing accounts of what they saw later on, which are really fun to read. A number of people, and this is something that's not covered much, a number of guys were out manning stations around the test site at some distance to measure radiation, and there were soldiers out there prepared to evacuate people if the radiation levels got too high in a fallout situation in their areas. This Marvin Davis, who was an MP that came down in 1944, he was said in his account that he was on the west boundary of the Trinity Site area, which would have been west of base camp, with a guy with a Geiger counter. He was the escort for the guy with the Geiger counter, and they were in a Jeep driving up the boundary. There were also people up on US Highway 380, military personnel with guys, scientists with Geiger counters, all the way over to Carrizozo. And their job was to measure fallout after the explosion and stuff. So those people weren't at base camp, but they were part of the test.
So maybe you can talk about the fallout for a minute. How far did it go? What do we know about the intensity and its effects? Right.
You know, a lot of people come to Trinity Site thinking that the scientists didn't know what they were doing, didn't know what to expect. And based on the precautions they took, the welder's goggle, the bright flash of light, the people, the personnel out there ready to evacuate civilians in case the radiation, the fallout levels got so. They had some idea what was going to happen. Now, the scale of it probably was beyond what they expected. In fact, you can see that when you look at they had a pool for the explosion, what the yield would be. And the scientists would buy a number, a yield, and they had set amounts. And I think the Rabbi won that because he was late and he had to take 18 or 20,000 tons of TNT. And that was like the only number left because all the low numbers had been taken. And so I think that most of the scientists didn't expect this compression of the sphere to be quite as good or as sweet, as they often said, as it could be. And so they took the low numbers, and so the fallout, which was generated in the explosion, this uptake of metal and sand and earth into the fireball and gets irradiated, and you've got all these elements made, there's radioactive elements beyond the plutonium, cesium, radioactive iodine, et cetera, et cetera. Most of them fall back to steady states pretty quickly, but a lot of them have long half-lives, and so they live on as the fireball rises. Of course, it forms a mushroom cloud and goes up to 40,000 feet. We know that altitude is pretty accurate because the B-29 that was flying around, Parsons was in there, and they report that they think the cloud is at 20 or 40,000 feet. And then the prevailing winds start carrying that cloud to the northeast. And of course, your bigger dust particles, materials are falling out at ground zero and immediately to the north. And the smaller stuff starts falling out beyond that. And so you've got a plume of material distributed to the northeast. You go straight down the middle of that plume, you've got fallout materials, and as you get out perpendicular to that, it gets less and less and less. And it's measurable, and so there are guys out there measuring it. And this 40,000 feet gets this radioactive fallout up into the upper winds. And so it ends up going completely around the planet. It ends up going up out of New Mexico up into the Midwest. Kodak reports that some of their packing material around film has got some radioactive dust in it apparently and fogged some of their film.
And where were they located?
Kodak? Well, I don't know. It's the straw that they used, which I think came from the Midwest, the Kansas, Nebraska area, Iowa, somewhere in there is where the straw came from. So it was closer to New Mexico than Rochester, New York, or anything like that.
So there's been a lot of people concerned who were farmers or ranchers or lived nearby that there were long-term effects of this fallout. What evidence is there?
That's kind of tough because Los Alamos did not, the government I should probably say, didn't do a very good job of follow-up. They measured quickly right afterwards and they've done some studies immediately afterwards. And of course the fallout, once it hits the sandy soil, gets buried in the ground pretty quickly, so it doesn't become much of a hazard. It was probably a hazard for those first few weeks after the explosion, when it would have been close to the ground, on buildings, on foliage, things like that. But the government didn't do much fallout or follow-up on that. Of course, standards were not the standards we have today either. They tolerated much more radiological exposure than we would today. And the map that they made is pretty clear-cut, and you can see it on the web. There are colored versions of it and whatnot. So there is a group right now, for instance, the downwinders, the Tularosa downwinders, claiming that ranchers in their area were exposed. The only problem they have is that in that map that Los Alamos produced, where they measured radiation, Tularosa in the immediate area is not in that plume at all. And so they're probably going to have to prove that fallout actually came to their area before they're going to have a legitimate claim with the government. How they do that, I don't know. The fallout's still there, buried in the soil somewhere. Whether you can find it and prove that it came from Trinity Site, something I don't know anything about. So it's still a sensitive issue. And at the open houses, we have protesters that sit outside the gate and carry signs, letting the public know that this is still a concern for some people.
And the protesters' messages are about the downwinders, or?
Yes, yes. It doesn't have anything to do with current use of nuclear weapons or anything like that. It's tied specifically to the test back in 1945.
Was there compensation, or did they decide that some of the ranchers needed to be compensated for singed hides? Or
yes, in a sense, there's the famous case of the cows that had fallout on one side, hit their hides, and the hide or the hair was burned, and so it was white, and on one side. Those cattle were purchased by the government and studied. And after the first year, and they did reproduction studies and all that to see if the offspring had genetic damage. And I really don't know much about that, except that there wasn't much found. And the cattle then were released. Eventually their hair fell out, and a lot of them, it grew back, and so you couldn't tell them apart from regular cows anymore. Some of the cattle went to the zoo in Alamogordo, and so Alamogordo had its atomic cattle on display for quite a while. You know, the big thing for fallout and real concern early on would have been the radioactive iodine. Iodine would have been one of the products of the, and of course iodine gets in the food chain, because as it falls out onto the grass, cows might eat that grass, and it can become part of the milk that the cow produces. And then a child, especially children, would drink that milk, and that iodine, of course, goes to your thyroid. That's why we have iodized salt, because your thyroid needs iodine. So, but it doesn't need radioactive iodine. And one of the dangers would have been this radioactive iodine becoming lodged in a child's thyroid and being there long enough to produce a cancer or a tumor or something like that. The thing, though, is that radioactive iodine has a very short half-life. And within, I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but within months, that hazard probably disappeared.
How about the eyewitnesses' account? Do you want to talk about any of that?
Eyewitnesses they pretty much agree on the basics of what they saw. However, being scientists, they're very aware of the limitations of being an eyewitness, being a human observer, and not having instruments. And a lot of them preface their account by saying that. You know, like there are a lot of accounts saying that it was brighter than the sun at the noonday. A lot of them say, well, it was very bright, but I'm not sure it was as bright as the noonday because my eyes were night acclimated at the time of the explosion. My pupils were wide open, so I can't say that. One of them actually tried a test. He said, I watched the explosion with my welder's goggles, and then the next day I looked at the sun with my welder's goggles on and determined that probably the explosion was close to the brightness of the sun or not, you know, that kind of a thing. But they all agreed that there was this huge flash of white, intense white light at the very instant of the explosion. Everybody agrees to that. Blinding kind of an explosion. And at the same time, they felt heat on their skin. The infrared radiation was hitting them. Marvin Davis says it was like opening the door to an oven to check on the cookies. So everybody, a lot of them describe that. In fact, the guys at Campania Hill, Teller and that crew, put on sunburn lotion. They didn't have sunscreen per se, but they put on oil on the exposed portions of their face because they knew they were going to get some infrared from the explosion. So they all agree on that. Then they talk about this ball forming on the ground and starting to grow upward, and it being a reddish, glowing red, roiling with dark, smoky stuff in it. Just a fascinating thing because there's dirt mixed into it. It's like it's on fire, an oil fire or something. And then it starts to raise up on this column, and that column is boiling in red and whatnot. And eventually that light, that internal light, goes away, and it's replaced by a glow in the ball itself, the fireball, which is a purplish, bluish purplish tint. And several of them talk about that. And that's from the radiation, they say. The radiation is so intense in that ball as it rises that it's glowing on its own. And eventually, of course, that rises and the glow goes away and it starts to fold over as a mushroom cloud, the typical mushroom cloud that we've all seen, which is typical of any big explosion. It's not necessarily a nuclear explosion. And after that, then we start to get some discrepancies. The shock wave, the sound, when the sound hits them. And they're reporting from all these different locations. Some have got mountains in front of them, some don't, etc. And so some of them talk about a rolling thunder kind of a noise. Some of them talk about a pop that hits them in the chest. And then a secondary pop or rolling thunder because the mountains reflect the shock wave as it rolls back at them a second time. And so and you can kind of map those based on their locations on the test bed. So those are the observations, and they're described in some detail. My favorite, though, is the deputy, Farrell. General Farrell was Groves' deputy. And this guy is so verbose. But he describes some of the explosion very nicely, and I used it on the Trinity Site brochure that I created for the missile range. And underneath a picture of the fireball forming, I've got General Farrell's, one of his quotes in there. Now, and I want to talk about the Trinitite, the glass, because when I first saw Trinity Site back in 1977, the accepted explanation on why the crater floor was once covered with this green glass was that the fireball sitting there as it started to rise heated the sandy bottom enough to create glass, to melt it, turn it to glass. And that's what we told people for decades. And then I got contacted by Rob Hermes and Bill Strickfadden up in Los Alamos. Hermes is a polymer chemist for him, and Strickfadden was a physicist. And they said they wanted to recalculate what the yield was, because the yield, and you read about it, and people say various things, everything from 18,000 tons to 21,000 tons of TNT. They said, in today's world, we ought to be able to backtrack that and deduce what the yield actually was. But we need sand from ground zero and sand back away where there was no involvement with the Trinity test. Okay, we can do that for you. We sent bags of sand up there, and Rob Hermes is a he's a sand collector. And he knows the value of ant sand. And he says, oh, by the way, are there any ant hills in Ground Zero? And I go, yeah. He says, can we get some of that? So I send them a baggie of ant sand. And so they look at the sand. In the meantime, Bill Strickfaden runs a model of the test using the Los Alamos models for atomic, because they got all kinds of models now. And he says, you know what? This idea that the fireball was there and melted the surface can't happen. It's not there long enough to melt sand and have half-inch thick pieces of glass. It just doesn't happen. It goes up and heat goes away. And so they said, we need to come up with a different mechanism to get glass on the ground. So they started looking at the sand, and there's pieces of trinitite in the sand. And in the ant sand, they start finding little bitty spheres, not just chunks, but spheres, perfect little spheres or balls of trinitite, of green glass. You're going, wow, how does that happen? Certainly can't happen with the fireball on top of it or anything like that. And it got them thinking about some other way to have glass on the ground. They came up with this idea that the tower is vaporized in the fireball, and they looked at the Ground Zero pictures after the explosion and deduced that, you know, there's a center section where it's not just a depression, it's actually gouged out. The sand is gone. And it probably got lifted up into the fireball as well, and it goes flashing to a liquid, maybe a gas comes back to a liquid. In other words, we get a mist up in the fireball of liquid rock, and it becomes raindrop physics after that. Stuff starts bumping together and they start falling out, and some of it, well, a lot of it, the little spheres of raindrops of glass harden and remain intact on the ground. Thus they are in an anthill, these little bitty droplets. Some of it comes down still in a liquid, puddles, and starts to form bigger puddles, and the heat still coming from above gives it a nice smooth surface on the top. And some places there is no the glass, and this mechanism starts to explain pretty much everything that we see at Trinity Site. When they went in afterwards, they found asphalt. They had asphalted the area around the tower. There's glass on top of the asphalt, which doesn't get explained by a fireball above. There's trinitite or glass on top of rocks, on top of fence posts, etc. And so the raining down idea of this material coming down, some of it is liquid, some of it is hard spheres or dumbbells or other shapes, explains all that. Then the guys do a paper about it, explaining all this, and they start looking through other old documents at Los Alamos. And lo and behold, they find a document from 1946 by a Nobel Prize winning scientist who proposed the rain mechanism in 1946. But the document was classified for decades. Nobody ever had access to it. So Rob and Bill can't say they invented this theory. They rediscovered it and popularized it, and now that's our accepted version of how glass got on Ground Zero. Now, most of the radiation at the site comes from this glass material. And the Atomic Energy Commission in 1952 or so, when they were getting ready to turn the site over to White Sands Missile Range, said they're going to clean it up. Los Alamos objected vehemently. Said, you're going to screw up the site. You're going to screw up any further study we can do at the site. And the AEC people said, we don't care. Because the lawyers said it was a legal medical decision, not a science decision. In other words, they didn't want anybody suing them for some supposed danger or whatever by leaving this glass exposed. So they bulldozed it. And they bulldozed up a lot of it that got buried into garbage cans at the site. Most of it, though, is just mixed with sand and blading over and smoothing out the crater floor. And so you've got a mixture of sand and glass now that goes down, I think, 16, 18 inches. And so the pieces of trinitite are always on the surface now as it rains and the winds blow and stuff comes up. And so when we have an open house, kids are always bringing us pieces of trinitite. We've tried to hammer it in their heads. They can't take it home with them. And so they bring it to us and we throw it away afterwards, throw it back on the ground. And we have displays of the glass. We have a really nice display the missile range does at the health physics display. This where our health physicists are there with Geiger counters showing what common sources of radiation look like a banana, cigarettes, a smoke detector in your house, all those things, leaded glass, etc. But they also have a big display case of big chunks of trinitite so that people can see what that glass really looked like back in 1945, 46, before it got all messed up.
So do you have some that are larger sheets that may have been...
Now, one of the things, after the explosion, the National Park Service, right away in 1946, wanted to make Trinity Site a national monument. Boom. And of course the military objected to that because that was at the north end of this brand new White Sands missile range. It was called Proving Ground in those days, where we're going to start firing V-2 rockets. And to cut off the north end of it was going to greatly limit what they could do with that. And so the military rejected it. And the Park Service then tried to get it a monument a number of times, and there's been back and forth about that. And finally in '65, the Park Service made it a National Historic Landmark, which the Army was able to live with and what it is now. But in those early days, there were discussions and meetings about all this stuff. And then when the AEC was turning it back over to, turning it over to White Sands, there was a meeting involving the Park Service, the AEC, Los Alamos was there, Holloman Air Force Base was there because they had an interest in the land. In fact, they owned Trinity Site for a while. And they decided that they needed to protect an original portion of the crater floor. And so they'd already erected a shelter over a spot to the west of where the tower was. And it was a set of poles with a tin roof or wooden roof over it. And they agreed to enclose that at that point and further protect that portion of the crater floor. So when they bulldozed it in '52, they did not touch that ground in there. Since then, when I arrived in '77, that wooden box was still there. Couldn't see into it or anything. In '84, when General Fulweiler got money to restore the McDonald Ranch House, some of that money was also used to knock down that old wooden structure and put a nice structure. We'd always heard that building was there to preserve an original portion of the crater. They knocked it down, it was just like desert. I mean, you couldn't tell any difference. But they put a building over it, and they put windows in it to look in. So we'd open the windows, you couldn't see anything. So then we got another iteration of the building later on, and I went up in the '90s with our archaeologist, Bob Burton, and we got inside the shelter, and we'd had a big door there, and we dug down, and under about 6 inches of sand, and we did it like archaeologists. It was pretty cool for me. And we got paintbrushes, and we get down to the hard stuff, and we uncovered an area like this of glass. It was all cracked and whatnot. It wasn't a nice clean sheet, but it was green glass. So in there is a section of crater floor protected. Now, we tried to open it, and after we'd uncovered it, make it possible for visitors to walk by and look at it. And so we brushed it off and stuff. Well, the next 6 months would go by and dust would blow in it. And as soon as you get a little dust on it, you can't see it. You can't see that shine and stuff. So we did that a couple of times and decided, we're probably destroying by cleaning it off each time. So we just locked it up and we don't bother trying to show it to people. They can see trinitite in the display at Radiological Health. Or they can buy a piece on eBay. Whatever.
So do you think that there may be other places where they're below, 6 inches or however many inches below the surface? That
I think that in that,
sheets of,
I think in that building that I was describing, which is, can't remember what the dimensions are, but it's at least 40 feet long and 10 feet wide, or maybe a little more, that underneath most of that is trinitite, underneath that sand. So there's a good chunk of it. So in the future, it will be available for researchers to be able to go in there and do something if Los Alamos needs to come down. Or if someday Trinity Site does turn into a national monument, and they can build a structure over it where you can walk through a cleaned area and keep the dust off of it without destroying it, and through an elevated catwalk or something like that, you could walk through and see it. That might be pretty cool. But I don't see that happening in my lifetime.
let's see. Maybe you could just talk about the crater, how deep it was.
They talk about, and when I first got there, we talked about a plate-shaped depression 1,200 feet across. In other words, at the edges, there's very little depression. It gets a little deeper and a little deeper until you get to the center, and that's it. And we didn't know about a gouged out area and whatnot in the center. And so we viewed it as simply the explosion smashing down the ground, pulverizing the ground and compressing it, and then bouncing and going up. But Rob and Bill, when they were doing their research, pulled out the old pictures and looked at them more closely, and they got some of these reports. And at about 120 to 150 feet diameter, right inside that ground zero area, they found an area where the sand is gouged out. And so you've got a deeper area, an actual depression that's probably 6 to 8, 9 feet deep, depending on which eyewitness you talk to. And that's the sand we're talking about that got up into the fireball and turned into the trinitite that rained down on the site. So all that's gone now. And it's on a bit of a side of a hill, this ground zero area. So people often ask that, can we see that depression a little bit? And I think maybe you can on the uphill side of it. The hill comes down, there's a little steeper bit of a hill as it comes down to where the obelisk is that marks exact ground zero. So it's interesting though that the green glass, while it existed, shone like water. The people talk about seeing the reflection off that surface miles away when the sun was at the right angle, because it's just glass, and being very, very visible and stuff. And of course they walked on it and drove on it, and people stole it and stuff, but it quickly got broken up, so it wasn't as shiny after a while. It's pretty neat stuff.
So this green glass, it would have extended like in this 1,200.
That's about the extent of it. And you look at the pictures are hard to, the aerial photos, there's black, and of course they're black and white photos. It's hard to see what was charred and what was glass and stuff. I don't have an eye for it. It's one of the things that you see but you don't think about. Probably if we get somebody to do a really good study and look at those pictures in real detail, we can probably get a really nice view, explanation of where the glass was. I'm sure that there's more glass downwind, because the wind would have been pushing it that way, than there is on, say, the south side of the crater.
So those sort of classic pictures of Oppenheimer and Grove, who went to the site
in September,
in September, is there any indication that there's this great crater?
No, and that's one thing that bothers me about the description of this 6 to 8 foot gouged area and stuff, because they're standing, and of course the picture's a very tight picture and you really can't see very well, but there are other photos of the tower stubs at ground zero, and there's glass on them, and it doesn't look like a deep gouged out area. So I'm still a little uncertain about all that. I would like to see a broader image taken, weeks later, but I haven't seen one. I don't know if there is one or not. Some of the guys afterwards that were there stuck at Trinity Site up through 1946 took pictures. But again, they're pretty tight photos, and they're not particularly good photos of the ground zero area. But, you know, standing there with Oppenheimer and Groves at one of the footings, you don't have any indication that that's a gouged out area. And in fact, they dug those out, and the piers for the tower legs are right below the surface there. The concrete piers. So I don't know.
Dug those out.
Right,
So
and I put a picture of it in my book of one of those piers. They've excavated 2 of them to see how cracked and fractured they were. And so I ran one of those photos. Never seen those before until I started. Los Alamos now has a lot of their photos available, and high definition images. It's really nice. Used those to look at that stuff.
So tell us about Jumbo.
Ah, Jumbo. That's another one of those mythological beasts at Trinity Site. You'll hear people, if you stand, the Public Affairs has a little building there right beside Jumbo and the gate going into Trinity Site. And you sit there and you listen to people walking by, and they'll say, oh, that's what's left of the atomic bomb. That's the atomic bomb casing and stuff. You go, well, how could that be? So because of the uncertainty, we get back to that uncertainty of this explosion, whether you're going to be able to get those lenses of TNT or high explosives to all compress that ball of plutonium exactly correct and get the nuclear explosion. What happens if it's a little lopsided and whatnot, or some of them don't explode? You know, some of them are going to go off. You're going to have some sort of an explosion, but are you going to get any kind of a nuclear explosion? So they thought that they would have Jumbo built, and this was ordered in early '44, I think. Babcock and Wilcox in Ohio were tasked to build it. And it's a huge, huge container. A lot of people talk about it being like an old thermos jug, the insert for a thermos. And because it's a long cylinder and rounded at both ends. And so Babcock and Wilcox built this thing, and the specs were for the interior diameter to be 10 feet, and then the walls 15 inches thick, solid steel. And so they started off with and they had to take these big, huge pieces of steel, and they started with 6.5 inches thick pieces of steel, and they had to roll them and bend them, and then weld them together into a cylinder. I always challenge people that are visiting, go see if you can find the welds in Jumbo, because they're there. And then but then they put that on a lathe and turned it down to 6 inches thick. Then they covered that with 9 inches of plate steel. And these are sheets of steel that were 1/4 inch thick. So to get 9 inches, you need 36 layers of this. And they're overlaid like a brick wall would be overlaid. And then, of course, the rounded caps on either end. So this thing ended up weighing 214 tons. It was the largest piece of steel, single piece of steel ever manufactured. And Babcock and Wilcox, as they built it, this thing started to sink into the floor. They had to shore it up and stuff. And there was only one rail car in the United States that could actually handle Jumbo, and it came from one of the steel companies. And they used it to haul these big ladles of steel around their plant. So they got Jumbo onto the rail car to move it from Ohio to New Mexico. Well, they couldn't just go boom straight through because bridges, tunnels, etc. couldn't handle the size of this thing. So they had to loop up through the upper Midwest and come back down, and ended up at what they call Pope Siding on the railroad west of Trinity Site. It's down by the Rio Grande, and they unloaded Jumbo on a huge trailer that had 64 wheels on it. They used a bunch of bulldozers to push and pull it up to ground zero. And by the time they got this all manufactured, hauled to the site and all that stuff, they decided not to use it. And because it would interfere a lot with measurements. Again, this idea of collecting data. If the bomb is all locked up in a bottle, you can't see anything until the bottle gets vaporized or blown to pieces. So there's very little chance of collecting much information. Plus, they were more confident it was going to work. So Jumbo simply sat on the ground 800 yards from ground zero during the test. The tower around Jumbo was just boom, blown over, twisted and mangled. Jumbo was undamaged, being that chunk of solid steel. Later on, Groves used the destruction of the tower to describe to the folks in the Pentagon the power of the explosion. He equated it to a so many story building of good steel. At the end he said he would not consider the Pentagon as a safe haven from such an explosion or such a bomb. So then in 1946, the Army, who was up there for White Sands Missile Range, put 8 500-pound bombs in Jumbo, still standing on end, and managed to blow off both ends. And it fell over. And Los Alamos was really peeved. They'd spent all this money to have this thing built, and then the Army had gone and blown off both ends, and they got no data. They have no idea what pressures were like. Plus, the Army put the bombs at one end, at the bottom end, instead of in the middle where the bomb would have been, the atomic bomb. So they were upset. This thing was destroyed. Jumbo then sat like laid in an arroyo, basically, for years. In the 50s, the 9 inches of plating around the outer cylinder disappeared. We don't know how, why. We got a picture from the early 50s of it intact, but by 1960 it's gone. And then in 1979, the missile range, we moved it to the parking lot so that people could see it. People were always asking about it. Where's Jumbo? Can I see Jumbo? And so we used a little Egyptian technology to move it over there and put it on display, and people walk by it. The kids love playing in it. And in there you can see the jagged portion of one end of Jumbo where the bombs were placed, where they gouged out chunks of steel from the inside of Jumbo. So that's the sad story of Jumbo.
Can you tell us anything about that 100-ton calibration test?
Oh, calibration test. Yeah, again, because we're testing and we want to collect as much data as we can for the test, and we don't know what exactly is going to happen, we probably ought to know how it's going to go with our timing mechanism, how our cameras are going to work, how our blast gauges, seismographs, make sure that all that stuff works before the real event. So on May 7th, they stacked 100 tons of TNT on a 20-foot wooden platform just south of Ground Zero. It's just east of our present parking lot out there. And the boxes of TNT came in freight cars from the railroad. They trucked it up there, and they had a little elevator device on one side, and they lifted it up so the guys didn't have to carry it up the stairs, because these were like 75, 80-pound boxes of TNT. And then they set about stacking it, and they didn't stack it in a square. They designed it so that it was kind of a circle, so that it would have more of a smooth circular wavefront, the shock wave. And they interlaced in it some tubes that they filled with radioactive slurry from one of the reactors at Hanford, so they could go in afterwards and kind of look for the dispersion of that radioactive material with Geiger counters or detection devices. So they did the test, and they exploded it early in the morning, and it's lucky they did it, because they found out that timing on, I think, some of the cameras was off, and they had to reset that to make sure that the cameras turned on at exactly the right time. So they created a crater. They even ran their lead-lined tank. They had 2 lead-lined tanks to collect data at the Ground Zero crater after that test. They ran one of the tanks through their little crater they created with the 20 or the 100-ton test. So that was quite an explosion, but nobody reports hearing anything in the surrounding area. You'd think 100 tons going off would be loud.
I think they had a ready story.
Oh, I'm sure they did. Another explosion of an ammo dump or whatever,
Right.
which is what they used for the main explosion. A common concern for visitors is the amount of radiation left at Trinity Site. Some people aren't aware that there's any. Some people think there's a lot, that it's dangerous, etc. I mean, it's pretty typical that Americans don't have much of a scientific background, so they don't know about these things. And so there's some fear as well. For instance, just a few years ago, we had, after everybody left the parking lot, we went out there, we saw something out in the parking lot, went out there, and there were 3 pairs of shoes and pairs of socks laying on the parking lot. We're going, how do 3 people leave behind their shoes or whatever? So we figured that they were afraid to take home any kind of radioactive dust they might have collected at ground zero in their shoes. So they left their shoes behind. So the site, when you have an atomic bomb explosion, you got high levels of radiation. So those first minutes, hours, and days after the explosion, ground zero is very radioactive. You wouldn't want to be there. But a lot of these materials, the half-life is very short, and they're going back to stable states very quickly. And the longer half-life materials are the ones that we're in now. In fact, when you plot this, and you've got radiation levels up here on the vertical axis and time on the bottom, you go out far and the radiation drops very quickly and then kind of flattens out, plateaus out, and it's going to be like that for years and centuries, etc., as we get down. But so radiation levels were fairly low within 2 months at ground zero. That's why Oppenheimer and Groves took the news media out there in September. However, their time was limited, probably to less than 30 minutes at the site, because it was still fairly hot. Later on in that year, we had people going out there for hours at a time and receiving dosages less than the standard limit for that time. And by the 50s, we're talking about, and I'm going to use dosimeters, millirems as my measure. They use a more modern terminology now, but I know millirems, and that's what I can equate it to. It really doesn't matter if you're comparing one thing to another. So now at ground zero, you're getting, if you spend an hour there, you'll get 1/2 to 3/4 of a millirem of exposure. Now, to put that in perspective, we always talk about other kinds of exposure, like a chest x-ray, maybe many millirems. And so we're talking about a fraction of a chest x-ray or a dental x-ray. And the easiest one to compare it to is airline flight. Airplanes flying at 35,000 feet are exposed to cosmic radiation, gamma rays, etc. That exposure rate is almost the same as ground zero at Trinity Site. So if you're a pilot or a stewardess in an airplane or a passenger flying at 35,000 feet, your exposure rate is about 0.5 millirem per hour. Same thing as at ground zero. So I've been going to Trinity Site for 40 years now, and I've probably gotten a certain accumulated dose, but it's probably less than the long-haul pilots, co-pilots, etc., that have been working a full career flying transatlantic flights or whatever, because they're up there for hours and hours at a time, whereas I'm only at ground zero for a few hours at a time and only a few days of the year. So it's considered totally safe as long as you don't eat the trinitite. The trinitite, if it's ingested into your body, could lodge in an organ or your bones or something like that and continue to emit the alpha-beta particles that are coming out of it and could cause a cancer or something like that. We don't anticipate that as an issue because nobody's tried to eat it yet. And so the area itself is about 10 times higher than background radiation for southern New Mexico. Of course, there's radiation everywhere. I once had a person come up to me and after I explained that there's background radiation wherever you go, and there are places on the planet naturally more radioactive than ground zero at Trinity Site. She came up to me and says, well, is there any place safe? And I'm going, well, sorry, you're a product of it, and there's nowhere to go, because once you leave the atmosphere of the planet, space is filled with radiation. Something we don't really talk about with astronauts much, but they get big doses too. So it's not a hazard, and we try to educate the public at the radiological health place, again with a Geiger counter and common sources of radiation. One year, the great story, Lisa Blevins was our radiological health person up there, and she used to do it every year. And her partner, Robert Huffmeyer, had thyroid issues long before this. He had a bunch of health problems. And so he had to have his thyroid destroyed. And they used radioactive iodine, of course, to basically burn up the thyroid. And he had this procedure done a day or two before the open house. And so he came to the open house and worked with Lisa. And Lisa would get a big crowd of people there, and she would have on the table all these items, and she'd take the Geiger counter in front of each item and go click, 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 click. You know, it was no big deal. And she'd get to the end, and she'd put it up to Robert's throat, and it would just go buzz off the scale. And so she would explain the medical benefits of radiation and stuff, and it's making Robert's life a little better now. So, education.
That's great. Do people ask, or can you talk about the significance of the Trinity Test?
Well, I mean, it's so obviously important that the National Park Service wanted to make it a national monument in a heartbeat. And I think most people realize that. I mean, most folks realize that, and they've been told this a lot, that this is the beginning of the atomic age. This is the beginning of nuclear weapons and whatnot. And it influences everything about our lives. We don't think about it much as citizens, but those weapons are still out there. They're still part of strategic planning and everything. So they're part of our lives, whether we like it or not. Some people, the picky folks and a lot of the scientists, will argue that Trinity Site is not the beginning of the atomic age, that Fermi's nuclear reactor in Chicago is actually the beginning of the nuclear age, because he proved that you could sustain a chain, get a chain reaction going and sustain it. The next step was obviously to get a quick chain reaction for an atomic bomb. But so Fermi's work at the squash court under the football stadium at Chicago is often cited as the beginning of the atomic age, but it doesn't have the pizzazz of a nuclear bomb explosion, the sex of an explosion. So most people will tap into the bomb explosion there. And of course it had great repercussions in the Second World War. And we can talk about that, and that's something that comes up. It used to come up more than it does now. People wanted to argue about, should we have used it against Japan or not? And a lot of people, and there are a lot of arguments for and against, lots of arguments. And I tried to summarize some of those in the book and stuff, but there's one thing you can't argue about, is that the bombs were dropped on August 6th. The Hiroshima bomb was a uranium bomb, the gun bomb. August 9th was the implosion bomb, the same thing, tested at Trinity Site. And less than a week later, the war was over. Boom, it ended. And so that result is probably hard to argue with.
It's interesting that you mentioned this young radio reporter.
Oh, Cremines, George?
Yes. Can you talk about that tape? Maybe we can actually find a copy. Or you have the...
I don't know if the museum at the missile range has a copy or not. They kind of lost track of it when I left my office, and I think it may exist. But okay, so Oppenheimer and Groves take the news media to Ground Zero in September, middle of September sometime, and to demonstrate that, well, it's not as bad as the Japanese are making it out to be. And so they're there 30 minutes and they leave. Well, George Cremines somehow talked to the Manhattan Project and finagled a visit for himself, all alone, as a radio reporter from Des Moines, Iowa. The Civil Air Patrol of Iowa flew him to New Mexico. And so the week after the big visit, Cremines visits. And he gets permission to fly over the crater in the airplane. And part of the tape is him commenting about what they're seeing below. And then he gets to go to Ground Zero. And he doesn't have Oppenheimer and Groves and stuff. He gets to interview Bainbridge at the site. And there are photos, and I've included a number of them in my book, of him being interviewed, of Bush being there. Lieutenant Bush is the security guy. And so he's there, and these support soldiers are there. And Cremines then goes down to base camp and interviews the soldiers that are stuck there after the war is over. And they're talking about what they saw at the site. And he also interviews people in Socorro. And so he's there for several days. He goes back to Iowa and turns this into 4 15-minute reports that air in Des Moines. The ABC radio network then gets a hold of it and puts it all together in a mishmash of a single 15-minute report. And that's the tape that we had. That George called me up, and I eventually took him to Ground Zero. That's where we got the photos. He gave me an envelope with the photos, and we were able to make copies, and he gave me a tape, and we were able to reproduce that. He did not have the original tapes that he made in Des Moines, just the ABC one. We thought, oh, this is great. We tried to play it at the Schmidt-McDonald Ranch House. We had a portable recorder up there, a playback player. And it was a big mistake because it's 15 minutes long. And people stood around and listened to it. I wanted to hear the whole 15 minutes, and they just started to pile up in the ranch house. The buses are bringing them, and and then it replays again. We got a big gaggle of people and stuff, and we decided that was not the way to go. And so we quit doing that, and the tape resided in public affairs for a long time. I'm hoping you can get a copy of that, because you think it's going to be great because he's talking to Bainbridge and stuff, and they're flying over. But it's like everything is, I mean, it's so nothing. It's so general that it says nothing. Yeah, it was a big explosion, and yeah, it was bright, and yeah, we could feel the heat, and yeah, I mean, there's just not much said. It's kind of disappointing. You thought you might learn something, you don't.
Even the 15-minute version is...
That's what I'm talking about, is the 15-minute version.
Yeah, too bad.
I mean, the Bainbridge is so tight-lipped, you know, he's under such restrictions of what he can say that... And of course, also, the science is perceived as being, nobody's going to understand that. I mean, my gosh. And so they don't talk about it at all.
That's interesting. Let's see. There's a, you mentioned in your book, discussion or an interview with Bainbridge and Robert Wilson at Trinity in 1988 by the Smithsonian, the interview there.
You know, and I don't remember, I was there as a lackey to make sure it happened and stuff. And I remember them being interviewed and listening, but I don't remember what they said. I mean, it was just pretty general, I think, about the site and stuff. Yeah. And you can probably see pretty much anything they've said online anywhere now. Mm-hmm. I remember, though, I got a picture of them toasting. It was hot, and we had ice water for them, and it was down at base camp, and they toasted their paper cups of ice water.
Oh,
so it was kind of neat.
Oh, that is neat. When we started out, you thought you might talk a little bit about a couple of the personalities, including Bob Wilson and Bainbridge. Do you want to?
Well, being a typical American setup, I mean, the reporting on Trinity Site is, well, probably the Manhattan Project and everything else, is always about Oppenheimer and Gross. I mean, they rarely delve down to the other people, and there are so many interesting characters involved in this that deserve books and shows unto themselves. And so for Trinity Site, Wilson was an important character because he was in charge of instrumentation. He's in charge of making sure they collect that data, not just the photos, but the nuclear stuff and whatnot. And they don't necessarily have off-the-shelf instrumentation that they can use. They've got to improvise. And so they do that. And Wilson's the head of that program. Bainbridge is the test director. And he's got to pull all this stuff together and keep all these people organized and stuff. And both these guys are great scientists and stuff and doing all these other things. And I love Wilson's comment later on. He's the first director of the Fermi Lab. I mean, that's not a slouch position. And his influence is everywhere there because he was on board when they built it. And the sculptures and all that stuff, the buffalo herd and all those things that he made happen. And my favorite is that when he's being grilled in front of a Senate committee for funding for the Fermi Lab, a senator, well, the group in general, and they're in favor of this and they want to support him. And they know that if they can tie his work at the Fermi Lab to defense during the Cold War, that the spigot, the money spigot, will just turn on. It's a given. And so they keep asking him about it. What does the Fermi Lab do for the defense of the country? And Wilson is very honest, straightforward guy. He says, you know, this is pure science. It doesn't have anything to do with the defense. And finally, he gets a little fed up with it. The senator asks one more time, and Wilson gives him a nice little talk about what makes the country valuable, its people, its arts, its sciences, etc., and that the Fermi Lab doesn't do anything for the defense of the country, but it's what makes the country worth defending. I'm paraphrasing, but boy, that hit home for me, and I love that. I think we lose sight of that in this country so much. When I first got to Trinity Site and started learning about it and heard the people talking about it, and they would talk about the first atomic bomb. Everybody knows that the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima from the Enola Gay, and Tibbets was the commander and stuff. The second bomb, Nagasaki, not so much. Okay, it was dropped from Boxcar. Okay, and Sweeney was the pilot. Okay, it's not nearly as big a deal as the first one. And so when people said that, I always assumed, since it was a B-29, which was built to carry a load of bombs and stuff, that they were saying B-O-X-C-A-R, boxcar, like a railroad boxcar. And I'm going, okay, well, that makes sense, boxcar. So not until years later did I learn the real story of this, that the airplane was Fred Bock's, B-O-C-K, his airplane. He was the pilot for that airplane, and so they had named it B-O-C-K''S car for his bombing runs and stuff. And he was tagged for the Nagasaki run to fly his airplane and provide camera support, stuff like that, collect data. Well, it turned out Sweeney was supposed to fly and drop the bomb, but Sweeney's airplane, the Great Artiste, wasn't ready to carry the bomb. So they switcherooed airplanes. Sweeney flew Boxcar and dropped the bomb, and Fred Bock flew the Great Artiste and provided data collection during it. So I got to meet Fred Bock at Trinity Site. The 509th came for one of the open houses and stuff, and we talked about that. I thought that was kind of funny. He was a nice guy. And a lot of them had interesting stories. You know, Carl Rudder, we got a lot of photos from him that are not official photos. Rudder was a guy who had specific skills, and he was drafted probably for Trinity Site or Los Alamos. And I'll contrast that to Felix de Paula. Rudder worked with a TVA in Tennessee. And he thought when he was signed up for the Army that he was going to work for the TVA in an essential position there, bringing his linemen, his mechanical expertise and stuff. And he gets drafted. He goes to basic training. This is like January of 1945. He goes to basic training for like 2 days. They then ship him to another camp, and then he goes to another camp. And he ends up in Trinity Site like 2 weeks after he gets inducted into the Army. No basic training or anything. And he is in charge of all the machinery, the generators, the pumps, the lines, and all that stuff, all the power-based stuff, and keeping it running. because there's no hard power at base camp. It's all supplied by generators, and he's got to keep all that stuff going. And he nicknamed it, he called it the, I'm probably paraphrasing a little bit here, the East Jesus Socorro Light and Water Company that he was in charge of. But he had these specific skills that made it possible for him to skip all the Army stuff and go directly to Trinity Site. Now, Felix de Paula, on the other hand, was at base camp as well as a soldier. He was an 18-year-old enlisted guy from New York City. Never been out of New York City, I mean, any length of time or anything. And so he knew, he had no skills. He was out of high school, that's what he had. And so he was assigned to the engineers at base camp. And when they were giving out jobs and stuff, they had somebody that needed to go around to all the buildings and tents and stuff and pick up trash. He volunteered to do that. And so that was his job. In fact, when he came back to visit, he pointed out to our archaeologist where he thought the dump was, which hopefully they've got that information, because that would be a fantastic dig to do someday. But Felix was always afraid of, so he had no skills as opposed to rudder and stuff, but Felix was afraid of snakes, and so he always carried a big stick with him. He'd always beat the desert in front of him as he walked, so he'd scare the snakes away. And he came out of his barracks one day, and he had his big stick with him, and there was a snake slithering under some boards. And he figured it was a bull snake. It looked like a bull snake. And he knew it wasn't, so it wasn't poisonous. So he's trying to get the snake out from the boards with his big stick. And the stick gets hung up under one of the boards. He's got it underneath the snake, and he can't get it out. He gives it a big jerk, and it lets loose. And he ends up flinging the snake over the building beside him, completely over it. And his buddy's with him, and he says he gives his buddy a look like, don't say a word. And they walk out between the buildings, and there is a line of men standing waiting to get in the mess hall because it's next to the barracks. And the snake has fallen down into the line with the men. And he says he looked around there, and they're all looking up in the air trying to figure out where the snake come from. And they thought it was a hawk or an eagle had dropped the snake. And Felix said then, and he told this story then for the Smithsonian at Trinity Site. He says that's the first time he's come clean on this and told the public that that's how the snake fell amongst those people at base camp.
That's funny. You know, he's still alive.
Is he?
Uh-huh.
That's great.
He's on our list to be interviewed. We almost interviewed him last February, but he wasn't available. So.
We'll be sure to ask him about his snake.
Yes, I will. That's a good story. That's really good. Oh, then there's Marvin Davis. Does he have any?
Marvin is gone now, but he was an MP. He wasn't a scientist or a technician or anything, and he was there the whole time. He came in December 1944, all through 1945, and did not leave Trinity Site until 1946, early 46. A lot of them were that way. Before they finally got to go home. And so Marvin was there pretty much most of his time, although he did serve in Los Alamos as an MP up there and whatnot before that. And so he was into it. He was interested in all this, and he was tickled by the fact that he was there and he got to see all this. And so he wrote us letters and came a couple of times. He came to a couple of the open houses. And I know I interviewed him for our television out there once. I don't know what happened to the tape, if it's still around or not. But his letters were the best because then you're thinking about what you're writing, every word, and you get more information and stuff. And then a year later, he'd say, I remember this and stuff. And he talked to other men that he was with, trying to get them to send us pictures and stuff. He wasn't very lucky at that, but he was a really nice guy and gave us stuff too. He donated a few things to the museum for the Trinity Site room that we have at the White Sands Missile Range. For instance, he had a twisted bolt that's probably from the 100-ton test on May 7th. The wooden structure was all bolted together. So it was probably sprayed out material all over the place, and he got one of those bolts. He also had his last dosimeter badge which had a piece of film material in it and also a piece of capsule of phosphorus to measure different kinds of radiation. I think in the book, in the back, I've got Los Alamos's analysis. We sent it up to Los Alamos to ask them what it was, and they looked at it.
So are there any, let's see, here's David Rudolph.
Yeah, I only met David a little bit, and we really didn't get to talk, but I did read his, years ago, his account a little bit. And I used one quote from it about, let's see, Los Alamos was remote, Trinity Site was penal, I think is what he said. So that was tough. And the guys talk about that, being isolated, not knowing what you're doing. You know, none of them really, they weren't scientists, technicians, they weren't picking up on what was going to happen. They were just given orders to do things. They kind of gathered that there'd be an explosion of some sort, I think, but not really anything else. And so they had to just, and they talk then about the dealing with the day-to-day living up there, about how hard the water was out of the wells. They couldn't run it through the pipes at base camp because it just plugged them up within a few weeks. And so they ended up trucking all their water from Socorro. In fact, Marvin sent a picture of himself on the water truck because he ended up driving it to Socorro to fill it with water lots of the time. Food was bleak military fare, and Lieutenant Bush, who was a real leader, understood the importance of keeping the morale of these guys up so they're doing a good job. He let his trusted personnel take the military rifles out and hunt. And so there are a lot of photos. Carl Rudder's scrapbook has photos of deer, antelope that the guys shot. That meat then went to the mess hall and got put into the stews and whether junk that the Army sent them. So they had some fresh meat in there. One account, I'm trying to remember who this was that maybe it was the fire marshal. There's a guy named Borg or something. He confiscated a bunch of alcohol from the lab because I think it was after the test, and considered it a fire hazard. So then the word then went out to all the soldiers to bring whatever soft drink or whatever you mixed with booze to the firehouse, whatever that was, tent, and they would all drink booze, the alcohol mixed with pop or whatever. Root beer, I guess, was the popular thing. And so that was interesting. And of course, after the explosion, there wasn't much pressure to keep up with things and whatnot. Marvin talked about Bush bringing in a busload of wax from Los Alamos for Christmas. And he said 20 or 25 of them came down. Spend Christmas, have dinner with the soldiers, maybe dance and stuff. And Marvin said the women were wilder than the antelope. He did not elaborate. One of the things that pops up with visitors, they'll say, because they've read something, they've read a book or some article, and it'll talk about scientists were worried that the atmosphere might be ignited by this test and incinerate the planet. And that was actually talked about, but if they ran the numbers, and Fermi was a jokester, he liked to dig people. He said, well, you know, it might ignite the universe, the atmosphere will burn. And apparently Groves called him on it because he was panicking some of the soldiers and said, you know, you got to quit doing that. Because it wasn't really that problem. I mean, sure, anything is possible. Like in the next 10 seconds, we're going to get hit by an asteroid and kill us right here, right now. Not likely. Not likely that this is going to happen either. And they were sure it wasn't going to ignite the atmosphere and burn up the planet. But writers, and this is my comment about writers, being a writer myself, you know, you got to have an angle, you got to have some way to interest people. And when you're writing something about Trinity Site, the Manhattan Project, there have been so many things done already, you've got to have a new angle. Otherwise, you're just repeating all the other stuff. So the deal, and of course, if it's sexy or exciting, that's better. So igniting the atmosphere is, boy, that's danger, et cetera, et cetera. And so people play that up, or used to, not so much anymore. The thing that they get played up in the last decade or so is why it's called Trinity Site. And the traditional story is that, and Groves wanted to know this too, he wrote a letter afterwards to Oppenheimer and said, why'd you call it Trinity Site? And Oppenheimer responded saying, well, he wasn't real sure, but he kind of remembers reading some John Donne poetry, and that brought to mind a John Donne line about batter my heart, ye three-faced God. And so he said, okay, let's call it Trinity Site. So that's what he said to Groves, but he said he wasn't real sure. That left the window open for speculation. And people have been speculating. And so a few of the more recent books have got pages of speculation about why it's called Trinity Site. We've got Near Eastern Buddhist stuff, mumbo jumbo, Native American spiritualism worked into it, etc., etc., etc. And so we in the Public Affairs Office, we got involved too. I mean, why not? We can make something up too. And so we tell people this when at the open houses, Trinity Site is the culmination of the work done at Oak Ridge, Hanford, and Los Alamos. All those three sites, that's a triad, a trinity. All that work came together at this site to produce the first atomic bomb. Trinity Site. And people look at us and go, wow, that makes a lot of sense. But just because it makes sense doesn't make it true. So, unfortunately, we can't claim that. But it is a better explanation.
That's great.
You know, when Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and I can't remember all the details on this, but when Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed, fire is what destroyed most of the cities. And the Buddhist monks at one of the cities collected some burning material and used it to keep an eternal flame going then. And then after that, they worked all around the world for peace. They wanted the elimination, basically, of nuclear weapons, certainly not their use, etc. At the end of 60 years, that's a normal lifespan or cycle for the Buddhists. They wanted to end that cycle. And so they asked for permission to end it at Trinity Site where it began. And so they brought and I can't remember if they actually brought a flame or material they were going to light at Trinity Site and put it out. And the Army, surprisingly, was good enough to let them in and let them do this, walk down to Ground Zero. And there was a crew there filming everything. And they did some prayers and stuff, and no big deal. It happened. Didn't seem to make a difference, but they were hoping that the cycle would end, of course. And we've had at open houses people expressing themselves in all kinds of ways. The fascinating thing about Trinity Site is when you've been doing it 40 years, is the site itself has lost a little bit of its luster, but the people are always interesting to watch them come in. Just this last year or two, we've been commenting about how this has evolved. How 40 years ago, the only people that had tattoos were sailors and some motorcycle gang guys. Now, beautiful young women are walking in with tattoos all over their bodies, and young men with tattoos, and everybody's got tattoos. And of course, in the summertime, it's all exposed. And I go, wow, look at that. So that's just a simple thing that's changed. But the crowds that are attracted to Trinity Site cover all the bases. I mean, in the old days, we used to get a lot of World War II vets. You'd have a guy come up to you and say, you know, this saved my life. I didn't have to go to the Pacific. I was in Germany or whatever, and I was heading for the Pacific. Don't see very many of them anymore. But you see school kids on a class assignment, young families, kid pushing baby buggies with kids in them, older folks, and just everything in between. Motorcycle gangs show up. I mean, there's just a variety of people that are there to see this site and to wonder what it's all about, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's kind of interesting to see those people and then talk to them and what they're thinking. Because I think they've changed a little bit in their thoughts. Like I said earlier, I don't think they're quite ready to argue much about the use on Japan. I think this the group now is more accepting of the use, that it ended the war, saved a lot of lives, etc., and they're good with that.
That's very interesting. How many Japanese visitors do you have?
There's usually some. And every once in a while, somebody will come and pray or something like that. And we don't bother them. As long as they don't bother anybody else, we let folks pray or do whatever they need to do for self-fulfillment. But in the past, we had a lot of Japanese journalists. You know, in my book, I put in there that I'm in Japanese Playboy magazine from 1980, I think it is. I had a photojournalist that I took in, and he took a lot of pictures and then wrote a big story. And he included a photo of me unlocking the gates at Ground Zero. So I'm in Playboy. There's very few people that can say that. Guys that work for the government, anyway. So, and I have done a lot of different things for Japanese journalists, TV people. Picked up pieces of Trinitite for them. It's interesting, they are remarkably afraid of it. I'll sit there and hold a piece of Trinitite in my hand so they can film it, but I go like this and they back away. They have no understanding of the science and what it's involved and what the risks are or not are. They're just there to do a story. So they're there, and they attract a lot of attention. If there's a Japanese person there, the American news media will glom onto them and ask them for their feelings, their reactions to the site and stuff, whether they're news media or just a civilian visitor coming to see the site, tourist.
Did you do that yourself? Are there people in Japanese news media have expressed their...
Most of them are very professional and just ask you for the information, do an interview, whatnot, and they're very straightforward and stuff. One or two were accusatory, you know. They'd want to ask you, oh, well, you know, you've done this to my people or something like that. And you just have to go on. I mean, it's an emotional issue, and you can't argue. I mean, there's no point in it. You can't win. So, okay, that's your point of view. Let's go on with the interview. And I learned that with the missile range, too. I mean, we deal in risk because we test missiles and rockets. Stuff explodes, stuff falls out of the sky. And at one point, we were looking at launching rockets and missiles off the missile range, over the public's head into the missile range itself, using the missile range as a target. We'd done this before back in the 60s, wanted to resurrect it in the 90s. And I learned very quickly that generally people don't like risk imposed on them. They're quite willing to take risks themselves, smoke cigarettes, drive 100 miles an hour, drive drunk, jump out of airplanes at a heartbeat, but have the government say, we're going to fly a missile over your house and it's 1,000,001 that something might happen. They don't like that. And it's that perception of risk, control of risk, all those things figure into it, emotions that are aroused in that part of it. And of course, an atomic bomb elicits similar kinds of emotions because of the risks involved.